Olivia Hart tilted her chin slightly, her polished smile sharp as she announced, "Economy class is in the back, but since this flight's packed, you'll just have to squeeze in here." Her tone carried a trace of mockery, pulling a few chuckles from the nearby business class passengers. Rachel Monroe said nothing. She quietly slid into seat 12F, her movements calm and controlled. But moments later, when the plane made a scheduled stop at Andrews Air Force Base, the atmosphere changed. The squadron commander of the F-22s on the tarmac suddenly froze mid-stride, his eyes locking on Rachel. His voice cut through the hum of the engines. "Midnight Viper, rise!" A stunned silence followed. Within minutes, every single F-22 pilot standing on the runway snapped to rigid attention, saluting her. Inside the cabin, jaws dropped. Rachel's hand was steady as she tucked her boarding pass into the worn pocket of her gray hoodie. She remembered little of the chaos back at Seattle's airport. It had been just another blur of noise. But here, on this crowded plane to Washington, D.C., the world seemed sharper, deliberate, almost slowed. Her hoodie had seen better days, its cuffs frayed from time. A rip along her jeans knee was hardly noticeable, unless someone was intent on finding flaws, which, unfortunately, plenty of passengers were. As she walked down the narrow aisle, she moved carefully, avoiding the gleaming designer bags placed like trophies in the way. A woman in a perfectly tailored blazer looked up from her phone, earrings catching the cabin lights, and smirked dismissively. A man in a crisp pinstripe suit leaned toward his seatmate and muttered, "Looks like she lost her way to the bus terminal." His words weren't hushed. They were meant for her to hear. Rachel's expression didn't shift. She kept her gaze on the row numbers overhead and kept walking. She had no interest in proving herself to strangers. All she needed was to reach D.C. The atmosphere around her buzzed with smug superiority, the kind that fills a space when people believe they're above you. Glasses of complimentary wine clinked in business class. Laughter rolled like it belonged to an exclusive club. Sliding into 12F, Rachel tucked her battered backpack under the seat ahead. The pack was army green, an old relic patched with insignia from a base long behind her. Her seatmate, mid-40s with a Rolex glittering under the lights, gave her a quick once-over and turned back to his tablet. His name tag read Richard Hale, his cologne sharp enough to sting. Rachel ignored it. Judgment had long ago stopped leaving marks on her. Her dark waves of hair were tied back in a simple ponytail, her face bare of makeup. She could have passed for a student, someone scraping together enough for a last-minute flight. But the truth of who she was sat buried deep inside classified files, records stamped and sealed, never to see the light of day. They listed her as a reserve. They didn't mention the missions with SEAL Team 6, or the way her career had ended under whispers no one dared repeat. From behind, a woman in a sleek black dress leaned forward, her hair in perfect waves, her name tag reading Jessica Lang. Her smile was polished, but her eyes revealed the sting of superiority. "You must be thrilled to be on a flight like this," Jessica said, voice dripping with false sweetness, as though Rachel had never seen the inside of a plane before. A few passengers overheard, laughter rippling softly. Rachel paused, her thumb brushing the cap of her water bottle. She turned just enough to meet Jessica's gaze. "It's only a flight," she replied, her tone quiet but firm like a pebble hitting still water. Jessica's grin faltered. She leaned back, tossing her hair in an attempt to recover, but the edges of her poise had cracked. Rachel calmly faced the window again, fingers tightening around the bottle until the plastic creased. "Hey, quick pause." The storyteller's voice cut in. "Do me a small favor. Grab your phone, hit that like button, and drop a comment below. Tell me where you're tuning in from, or how this story is landing with you. If you've ever been underestimated or dismissed, this moment is for you. And if you want more stories like it, make sure you subscribe. Your support really matters. All right, let's dive back in." The flight hadn't even begun taxiing when the first open jab struck. Olivia Hart, the head flight attendant, stood at the front with a polished uniform and a smile pulled tight as piano wire. She was in her 40s, her sharp eyes quick to size people up, her voice sharp enough to cut without volume. One glance at Rachel's boarding pass had told her everything she thought she needed to know. "Economy belongs in the back," she'd remarked. Her tone sharpened with disdain. Richard Hale, the man with the Rolex and the pinstripe, leaned toward the slick-haired colleague beside him, gold cufflinks gleaming. Probably one of those budget ticket types, he muttered, loud enough for Rachel to catch. Rachel paused, hand resting on the zipper of her backpack, before finishing the motion deliberately, as though counting each breath. Across the aisle, a woman with glossy red nails let out a snicker. Rachel ignored it, fastening her seatbelt without even glancing up. The engines roared, the plane lifting smoothly into the sky. Rachel turned her eyes to the window, watching clouds drift like endless waves. Her hands rested calmly in her lap, hands worn by years at the controls of aircraft most people could never imagine touching. The woman with the lacquered nails. Tara Wells leaned closer to her silk-scarfed friend, perfume wafting between them. Bet she's terrified sitting this close to the emergency exit, she sneered, her grin cutting like glass. Rachel didn't so much as blink. Rachel's lips curved into a faint, almost unreadable smile, but she didn't bother turning her head. Instead, she reached for her water bottle, unscrewing the cap with a slow, deliberate motion. Tara's friend let out a sharp laugh that rang through the cabin like glass breaking. Rachel stayed silent, her eyes fixed on the horizon as though searching for something invisible to everyone else. When meal service rolled around, Olivia paused by Rachel's row, balancing a tray of business-class menus. Her eyes swept over Rachel's hoodie before she handed a glossy menu to Richard Hale, flashing him a polished smile. "Apologies, these are reserved for our premium passengers only," she said, loud enough for others to hear. Her glance slid toward Rachel, laced with superiority. A man in a tailored blazer 2 rows ahead twisted in his seat, chuckling under his breath. "Don't worry, she's probably used to drive-through meals," he quipped, his voice dripping with amusement. The cabin rippled with restrained laughter. Rachel's hand stilled on her water bottle. She lifted her gaze, meeting Olivia's eyes for the briefest moment. "Water's enough," she said, her voice soft yet steady, like a boundary drawn in the sand. Olivia faltered, blinking once before moving on, her heels clicking brisker than before. Rachel leaned back into her seat, fingers tapping once against the armrest. A controlled, deliberate gesture that spoke louder than words. Time slipped by. The cabin settled into a rhythm of clinking cutlery and hushed conversations. Rachel sipped her water, each movement measured, the discipline of someone trained to remain calm under pressure. Richard Hale kept sneaking glances at her, his brow furrowing like he was trying to pin her down. Eventually, he leaned closer, his tone thick with condescension. "Heading to a job interview? Better hope you've got something sharper than that hoodie in your bag." Rachel slowly turned, locking eyes with him. "I'll manage," she replied, her voice low and unshaken, like steel sliding into place. Richard blinked, caught off guard, then muttered something vague about kids these days before burying himself in his tablet again. Rachel returned her gaze to the window, her expression unreadable. Her hand brushed the edge of her seatbelt, making a slight adjustment as though grounding herself. The intercom crackled to life with the captain's voice. "Folks, we'll be making a short stop at Andrews Air Force Base to refuel. Won't take long." Rachel's head lifted a fraction, her eyes sharpening as the military runway drew into view. Sleek jets lined the tarmac, sunlight gleaming off their wings as personnel moved with practiced precision below. Her fingers tightened briefly around her water bottle before she set it back down. Nearby, Olivia caught the subtle change in Rachel's posture. "Something grab your attention?" she asked, suspicion edging her tone. Rachel didn't answer right away. She kept her gaze fixed outside, her hand resting quietly in her lap, as if watching something only she could see. As the plane dipped lower toward the base, a businessman in a crisp white shirt rose to tug his bag from the overhead compartment. His cufflinks glinted as he looked Rachel's way and spoke loudly enough for half the cabin to hear. "Some folks just don't know their place, huh?" he said, smugness dripping from his voice. A few passengers nodded in agreement, their smiles tight and knowing. Rachel's eyes flicked toward him for only a heartbeat before returning to the window. She shifted slightly, her backpack brushing against her leg. "I know exactly where I belong," she said, her words so soft they nearly vanished in the hum of the engines, yet the weight behind them was unmistakable. The man faltered, clearing his throat as he suddenly found his bag far more interesting. He sat down without another word. A hush rolled through the cabin, tension pressing into the silence. From business class, a man with a loosened tie leaned over his seat, his grin wide and arrogant. His name tag read Mark Ellison and his voice carried easily. "What's next? You planning to fly the plane?" he mocked, his laugh sharp and grating. A few passengers chuckled, their laughter pricking the air like needles. Rachel turned her head slowly, her dark eyes locking onto his. "I've spent time around planes before," she said. Her voice was calm but absolute, like a door closing with finality. Mark's grin wavered and he shifted back into his seat, suddenly preoccupied with his drink. Olivia raised a brow but said nothing, striding down the aisle with her heels clicking like punctuation marks. When the wheels touched down at Andrews, the cabin's energy shifted. Business class passengers straightened their jackets, checked their watches, and refreshed their phones as though preparing to step into a boardroom. Olivia's voice flowed through the intercom, crisp and controlled. "A select few passengers have been invited to meet the F-22 pilots on the tarmac. Please remain seated unless you've been notified." Her eyes slid toward Rachel as she spoke, a subtle reminder of who wasn't included. Rachel didn't flinch. She simply took another sip of water, her expression blank, as though she'd heard it all before. Her fingers brushed the edge of her backpack where a faded eagle patch caught the light for a fleeting second, before she tugged it back into shadow. "Tara." Wells leaned closer to her friend, her voice deliberately loud. "Doubt they'd want photos with someone dressed like that." Her laugh was sharp and polished, like she'd practiced it. The blonde in the silk scarf, her tag reading Donovan, smirked knowingly and nodded. From the row ahead, a man in a designer polo named Ethan Carter let out a quiet chuckle without lifting his eyes from his phone, the smirk on his face clear enough for Rachel to notice. She didn't glance up. Instead, she twisted the cap back onto her water bottle, every motion unhurried, deliberate, as if she were weighing the silence itself. The cabin seemed heavier, the air thick with unspoken judgment. As the select passengers gathered their things, a woman draped in a tailored coat and a cloud of sharp floral perfume paused at Rachel's row. Her eyes narrowed ever so slightly before she leaned toward Olivia, her voice pitched for others to overhear. "You'd think they'd screen passengers more carefully for flights like this," she muttered, disdain dripping from every syllable. Olivia's lips tightened in agreement. She offered the woman a complimentary drink, her posture sharp with subtle approval. Rachel's hand froze on her backpack. Her fingers brushed over the worn eagle patch stitched into the fabric. She lifted her gaze just enough to catch the woman's eyes. "Screening isn't my concern," she said evenly, her tone calm yet edged with quiet defiance. The woman faltered, her drink stalling mid-air before she retreated quickly to her seat. Rachel leaned back again, face unreadable, but her fingers tapped once against the armrest. A tiny, precise motion that carried more weight than words. Her gaze slid back to the window, to the row of F-22s standing on the tarmac like silent sentinels. For an instant, her fingers lingered over the eagle patch, the memory it carried breaking through unbidden, a night sky torn apart by tracer fire, engines roaring, a decision that had shaken her to her core, but kept her squadron alive. Her throat tightened. She blinked once, forcing the memory back into its cage. Tugging her sleeves down over her hands, she slouched slightly into her seat, the hum of chatter fading into background static. That's when Major Kyle Bennett entered the business class cabin. His uniform was razor sharp, his presence rolling in like a storm front. In his late 30s, with a jawline cut from granite and eyes that missed nothing, he commanded the space with every step. He exchanged handshakes with Richard Hale, with Tara Wells, polite, professional nods. Then his eyes fell on Rachel in seat 12F. He froze mid-handshake. The cabin carried on, oblivious, but Rachel noticed. She met his gaze head-on, her face steady, almost expectant. Her fingers brushed lightly at the edge of her seat. A grounding ritual. Without hesitation, Bennett strode directly to her row, his boots striking the floor with weight. "Are you Shadowhawk 12? He asked, his voice low, reverent. Rachel gave the smallest nod, her eyes never breaking from his. Richard Hale let out a derisive snort, thinking it some kind of joke. But Bennett's jaw tightened as he straightened. He spoke louder this time so every passenger could hear. "My apologies for seating you here. You are requested on the tarmac immediately." A ripple passed through the cabin. Rachel rose smoothly, slinging her backpack over one shoulder, her movements precise, the grace of someone who had repeated this exit countless times before. The whispers followed her. Still, she didn't look back. As she walked with Bennett toward the exit, a man in a sharp navy suit leaned into the aisle, his expensive watch flashing under the lights. "This must be a mistake," he announced, his tone brimming with corporate confidence. "She doesn't look like anyone of importance." Murmurs rippled through the rows. Passengers nodding, whispering. Rachel's stride didn't break, though her grip on the backpack strap tightened, her knuckles whitening. She tilted her head just slightly, her eyes locking with his. "Appearances can lie," she said softly, her words sliding through the air like a blade across silk. The man opened his mouth, then closed it again, sinking back into his seat with his certainty deflated. Bennett shot him a brief, cutting glance, a warning, before guiding Rachel forward. The cabin doors opened to the sting of jet fuel and the sharp bite of wind. Rachel stepped onto the tarmac, her hoodie tugged by the gusts. The F-22 pilot stood aligned in formation, uniforms immaculate, faces carved into composure. Bennett's voice rang clear, carrying across the airfield. "Attention. This is Midnight Viper, the one who led 3 squadrons through hostile skies." In perfect unison, the pilots snapped to attention, their hands rising in crisp salute. Rachel returned the gesture, her motion sharp, her expression calm, though a faint smile brushed her lips as she lowered her hand. For just a moment, the weight she carried seemed lighter, her eyes lingering on the jets as if she were home again. Inside the cabin, faces pressed against the windows, whispers swirled. Richard Hale scoffed, leaning back in his seat. "Sounds like some Hollywood script," he muttered. Olivia forced a thin chuckle. "Probably just an honorary title," she said, smoothing her skirt like the fabric would ground her unease. Claire Donovan leaned close to Tara, whispering, "No way it's real." Rachel didn't acknowledge any of it. Standing on the tarmac, hands tucked into her pockets, her eyes stayed fixed on the gleaming F-22s. Bennett's glance flicked briefly to the cabin windows, his expression cold, as if he had heard every doubt. Rachel's fingers brushed her hoodie again, that subtle grounding motion before she turned back toward the jets. A young officer stepped forward, carrying something weathered but reverent in an old flight helmet. It was worn but carefully preserved, the call sign Midnight Viper stitched boldly across the side. Bennett accepted it from the young officer and presented it to Rachel, his voice steady yet loud enough for the cabin to hear. "This helmet is only awarded to a pilot who completed a mission so classified. Most will never read its file." Rachel accepted it quietly, her fingers tracing the stitching as if reading an old memory. Then, with a fluid motion as natural as breathing, she slipped it on. The fit was perfect, like it had always belonged to her. A pilot barely in his 20s stepped forward, his tone almost reverent. "She's the one who saved my squadron." The other pilots shifted, their expressions hardening into respect, even awe. Another junior pilot, his features still carrying the softness of youth, stepped forward hesitantly. He held a small weathered logbook, edges frayed from years of use. "Ma'am," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "you signed this for me 3 years ago." He opened it, revealing her call sign scrawled in sharp, unmistakable strokes. The others leaned in, their eyes softening as recognition settled. Rachel brushed her fingers over the page, then looked at him with the faintest of genuine smiles. "You made it through," she said quietly. The young man's eyes gleamed as he stepped back and saluted again. Inside the cabin, passengers pressed against the windows, watching in stunned silence. The air hung heavy, thick with unspoken realization. Rachel returned to her seat, the helmet tucked under her arm. The atmosphere was different now, quieter, though not everyone was convinced. Olivia forced a polite smile. "Well, it's nice to have a special guest," she said. But her gaze flicked down to Rachel's scuffed sneakers. Ethan Carter muttered from across the aisle, arms crossed, "Probably just a PR stunt." Rachel gave no reply. She only bowed her head slightly, fingers brushing the edge of the helmet. The divide in the cabin was obvious. Curiosity on some faces, skepticism on others. She cared for neither. Settling into 12F, Rachel placed her backpack at her feet and looked out the window. As the plane readied for takeoff, a younger flight attendant approached her row nervously, holding a small silver eagle pin. "This is from the crew. For your service," she said. Stumbling over the words, the cabin grew utterly still. Rachel took the pin gently and affixed it to her backpack without a word. The attendant smiled, a real smile this time, before retreating. Even Ethan Carter shifted uncomfortably, his earlier arrogance dissolving. The engines roared, but before the captain's voice could finish over the intercom, another sound cut through, low and commanding. Two F-22s swept into formation alongside the aircraft, their wings flashing in the sunlight. Bennett's voice crackled over the radio, carried through the cabin speakers. "Midnight Viper, we never got to thank you for last time." Rachel leaned closer to the window, a faint smile tugging at her lips. She pressed the headset to her ear and spoke, her tone calm, steady. "Hold formation, Eagle One." The reply came instantly, a chorus of voices layered in respect. "Yes, ma'am." Silence swallowed the cabin. Richard Hale froze with his drink halfway lifted. Tara Wells's phone hung motionless in her hand. Olivia's forced composure faltered, her tray rattling slightly. No one spoke. No one dared. The F-22s held their formation, escorting the plane as it climbed higher into the sky. Rachel leaned back, her gaze steady on the jets. The cabin had transformed, every passenger now weighed down by awe, humility, or shame. Mark Ellison shifted uncomfortably in his loosened tie. Claire Donovan whispered to Tara, but the words were too soft to catch. It didn't matter. Rachel had heard enough. As the plane leveled off, a man in a tailored jacket, his face flushed with embarrassment, rose from his seat and stepped hesitantly toward her row. I didn't know who you were," he stammered, his voice just loud enough to carry. "I'm sorry for what I said earlier." Rachel looked up, her gaze steady, not unkind. She gave a small nod, nothing more, and turned back to the window. The man lingered awkwardly for a moment before retreating. The cabin felt smaller, the air thick with a new, humbling quiet. Rachel's fingers brushed the eagle pin on her backpack, a quiet reminder of who she was, and what they would never fully understand. The rest of the flight to D.C. passed in near silence. Passengers avoided idle chatter, each one subdued by the unshakable presence sitting in 12F. Rachel kept her eyes on the sky, watching as the F-22s peeled away in the distance. Her hand drifted back to the faded eagle patch on her pack, its stitching catching the light. She'd been 19 when she earned it. On a mission so secret, her own squadron never learned the full scope. The sky had been chaos then, fire and steel. Now it was just sky again. The radio had screamed with orders that night, but she had brought them all home. Every single one. Rachel blinked, the memory dissolving into the sight of the DC skyline rising in the distance. When the plane landed, the passengers moved slowly, as if still trying to process what they had witnessed. Rachel rose, slinging her backpack over her shoulder, the helmet tucked under her arm. She didn't rush. She didn't linger. Her steps were steady, her head held high. Richard Hale kept his eyes down, muttering into his phone about some urgent meeting. Tara Wells typed furiously on her device, her face pale. Olivia stood at the exit, smile stretched tight, her hands clasped too firmly. Rachel didn't look at any of them. She simply walked on, her sneakers silent against the floor. At the gate, a man was waiting. Tall, quiet. A presence that needed no introduction. His suit was tailored but unassuming, his gaze locked on Rachel the moment she appeared. He said nothing, just nodded and fell into step beside her. The cabin's passengers, scattered near baggage claim, went still. Ethan Carter dropped his phone mid-text, his smirk vanishing. Claire Donovan clutched her scarf, eyes darting away. Olivia shuffled papers with jerky, frantic movements. No one had to say his name. Everyone knew. James Monroe, Rachel's husband. A man whose reach extended farther than most dared imagine. Before they left the terminal, a girl no older than 10 tugged at her mother's sleeve and pointed. "Is that the pilot lady?" she whispered. Her mother, a quiet woman who had said nothing during the flight, looked at Rachel with a reverence that softened her voice. "That's her." Rachel caught the girl's wide eyes and gave her a small, warm smile, the kind that said, "I see you." The girl grinned and held her mother's hand tighter. Rachel's hand brushed James's as they walked on, the eagle pin gleaming faintly on her backpack, the helmet still cradled against her side. The terminal was crowded, but people seemed to part naturally, as though instinctively recognizing something greater than the faded hoodie and scuffed sneakers. The consequences came, swiftly, quietly, relentlessly. Richard Hale, the executive in the pinstripe suit, was a mid-level manager at a defense contractor. Someone had filmed his comments on the flight. By morning, the video went viral. His job was gone, his LinkedIn scrubbed clean. Tara Wells, the influencer with glossy nails, lost her biggest sponsor overnight. Followers dropped by the thousands. Her tearful apology post drowned beneath a flood of angry comments. Olivia Hart received a formal reprimand from her airline. No more international routes, just short domestic flights. Her dream career quietly clipped. Jessica Lange's firm distanced itself from her after the video surfaced, citing unprofessional behavior. Ethan Carter's startup lost a key investor. The news broke quietly, decisively. Claire Donovan's law firm issued a public apology for her conduct, and she was pulled from high-profile cases. Mark Ellison's consulting firm erased his name from their roster within the week. Rachel didn't see any of it unfold. She didn't need to. She'd lived through worse than their words. Missions where the sky was fire, where one mistake meant never coming home. Compared to that, this was nothing but noise. She and James walked through the terminal together, their steps perfectly in sync. The DC skyline loomed ahead, sharp against the horizon. Rachel stood at the edge of the tarmac, wind tugging at her hoodie. She didn't pull it tighter. She simply stood, steady as she had always been. The world had doubted her, mocked her, tried to make her small, but she had never been small. And for anyone who had ever been judged, dismissed, or silenced, her story was a quiet promise. You are not alone. You never were. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally, healing.